Hi everybody, welcome to CMN 153. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 16th. And believe it or not, we are headed towards the ending of the semester. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the final project. If you look at the notes below, I began the notes with something about advertising, an article that appeared in today's news about Apple and some of their plans to put advertising into their apps for the iPhone. So I thought that would be interesting, especially because we began the semester talking about the importance of advertising. And then the second part of our notes below is a website called Purdue OWL. And you might have heard of it from other classes, English classes. It's a wonderful website from Purdue University that's available for everyone, whether they attend Purdue University or not. So it's public access. And it talks about writing tips and techniques. And certainly you can find similar kinds of information on the GCC library website, which I encourage you to look at. And I'm sure you've taken English classes where you've had style books that also talked about writing. But we're at the point in the semester now that I'm hopeful that you have begun some writing about your final project. Now, that said, I had indicated that your final project could be a little bit more creative than your traditional academic paper. You could also utilize media as a way to examine media, so it could be very meta. For instance, you could film a short documentary if you wanted to, but if you did such a thing, I would assume that there would be some written explanation accompanying it. So at this point, I'm hopeful that you're thinking about your final project. Please reach out to me about ideas or questions that you've got about the final project. And I thought that this website on writing tips would be useful as well in case you needed a little bit of a refresher. For your journals, as you know, I haven't been evaluating for grammar or mechanics because they've been informal responses to the media that we've been talking about. But for your final project, that would be more formal. So it's assumed that you are going to keep to the conventions of an academic paper. In other words, that you've got a thesis, a main point that usually is in your opening paragraph, that you are supporting that thesis with evidence and details, and those are in your body paragraphs that follow. And then you give a sense of closure in your concluding paragraph. And that you've got a minimum of 5 paragraphs, but probably longer than that. Anything less than 5 paragraphs really isn't an academic essay. And I was indicating approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as you think it needs to be in order for you to be able to support your position. And each paragraph should be at least 3 sentences long, if not longer, because each paragraph needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the beginning, the opening sentence, is called the topic sentence, and that usually serves to summarize what the paragraph is about so that you can actually go through your writings, and ideally, if it's well written, you should be able to read the first sentence of all of your paragraphs and get a kind of skeletal outline that provides a kind of direction to your writing. And when we think about a sentence, it should express a complete thought or complete idea, and it should be able to stand independently from the other sentences. So when you're proofreading, you could, if you wanted to, just imagine each sentence alone and ask yourself, does this express a complete thought? And if it doesn't, then it's probably a sentence fragment, an incomplete sentence. And probably the missing piece is in the sentence immediately before or after. But remember, each sentence must express a complete idea. It has to have a subject, it has to have a verb. A verb is an action, a subject is who or what is performing the action. And it might have multiples, but it also has to express a complete idea. You also want to avoid run-ons when you're running together 2 or more complete sentences without any punctuation. So those are just some general mechanical errors that you probably are accustomed to hearing about. There also is something called a comma splice, where you are running together 2 or more complete sentences, and instead of using no punctuation, you're using the comma to separate the sentences instead of a period, and that's an error. So you can hear that there's a pause there, but you really need to have a stop. A comma is a pause, and the period is a stop. And I encourage you to read your writing out loud because oftentimes you can hear errors. And also, you might want to consider reading your writing backwards when you are proofreading so that you can concentrate on the actual sentences themselves. And then just some general points about writing. You want to try to avoid slang or informal language. You want to make sure that you are using the conventions of academic writing. You want to make sure that everything is spelled correctly. Yes, use your spell check, but understand that your spell check isn't necessarily going to find everything. And keep in mind that we have tutors available in the GCC Peer Tutoring Center, where you can get tutoring for free if you wanted some feedback about your writing as well. So I'm hopeful that all of this is review. In terms of writing, usually if you're using outside resources, that requires a works cited page. And what that means is that you've got a separate sheet of paper at the ending of your writing that lists all of the works that you've cited or you've quoted from. And this is what we use in the humanities, which is what this particular class is part of, the MLA, or Modern Language Association. And we list all of the resources that we've used in alphabetical order on that works cited page by author's last name. And there's slightly different conventions for how you would list a book as opposed to a website, as opposed to a magazine article. And all of that you can look up on Purdue OWL, or you can also look up at the GCC library. And within the actual paper itself, when you're quoting, immediately after the quote, whether your sentence is done or not is irrelevant. We use parentheses, and within that parentheses, we give a little bit of information about where to find that quote. The idea is that the reader can then go to the back of your paper and find all of the information about the author, the publisher, the place of publication, and so forth. Usually what we include in the parentheses are the page numbers. If it turns out that it's unclear what book we're using, then we might have to include the author's last name and the page number. If there are multiple reference or multiple texts by the same author, we might have to include a little bit of the title along with the author's last name and the page number. Again, I'm hopeful that this is all review for you. But certainly if you've got any questions or concerns, let me know. And Purdue OWL is a great website. Now, we are at the television and cable section. This one was a little bit tricky for me. I've been trying to keep to a certain level of chronology, acknowledging that something like music is perhaps the oldest media form that we have. But we began with books after we started talking about the internet and media convergence. And of course, that was after we talked about advertising and marketing, then public relations, the glue that basically holds all media together. And it would make a lot of sense to talk about music after radio because the two are so connected. But I wanted to talk about music after television, and that's because of the resurgence of a musical genre, the music video. And they had existed previous to MTV in the 1980s, but they weren't as stylized, and they certainly weren't as formalized as what we think of. And that began with MTV Music Television back in the days when they showed music videos, didn't necessarily have programming. And I wanted just to give you a brief overview of some of the elements of television and then have you watch a few videos about television. The 1960s to the 1980s were really the heyday of television. There really weren't many other options for entertainment. Yes, there were books, yes, there were magazines, but this was the first mass medium where individuals could consume concurrently, simultaneously, and it helped to form a cultural identity, for better or for worse, because we were all consuming the same media. So I'm part of this 1960s to 1980s, and this was the time of networks where you would have major players. At the time, it was thought there were only 3 major networks that were ever able to be successful: ABC, NBC, and CBS. And they all had their start in radio. We know how ultimately, how one media is usually borrowed by the media that follows afterwards. And we also know about Fox, because we've talked about that beforehand, how Rupert Murdoch was able to introduce a fourth television a fourth television station, Fox, in the 1990s, in part because he was able to buy the TV Guide, which was the most popular magazine at the time, because it listed all of the television programming. That was really the only way to access what was on television. And again, that was the major media vehicle of the time. And it was certainly the most accessible because it was in everyone's living room, oftentimes multiple sets, which still exists today. Though I think the internet has, as it has with all other forms of media, really changed the game. And TV saw that its profits came from advertising. In the early days of advertising, there would be a sponsor that would basically pay for an entire TV program. And television was live at the time, and the individual would basically promote that particular product. Now we know that the television commercials are for multiple sponsors and have become quite high end. In fact, we talked about the 1984 television commercial that helped to really change television commercials so that they became much more cinematic. Now, cable was a way to profit from both advertising and subscriptions, which was brilliant because then you had two revenue streams. Cable provided for better transmission quality, more diverse programming, more targeted programming, and it was in many ways like the way that film could direct storytelling, that you could target a particular demographic. It didn't necessarily have to be for a general audience, which is what television initially was, and still is today, though certainly standards have relaxed. This mass simultaneous communal experience, I can't begin to emphasize how important that is. It's one of the videos that I'm going to be asking you to watch. It's a TED Talk that will be talking about the idea of the conscience of TV and the cultural impact of TV. Before I get to that, I can talk about how television certainly has lost that experience now that we have so many avenues for entertainment. However, the Super Bowl still draws in the numbers that television used to draw in with its other programming. I don't think TV would really get those kinds of numbers again in our current time period unless there was some sort of mass tragedy, and even then I'm not sure if the viewership would be through television or if people would be accessing through the internet. So the history of television, and I also have a video for you to watch about some of the history of television, begins in the early 1900s with the cathode ray tube. And television, of course, was revolutionary because it allowed the transmission of both audio and visuals. Initially through radio waves, analog, and then from a transmission point, that would be a television station, to a reception point, which would be a TV set. 1934 would be the first public demonstration of television in Philadelphia. And so if we think about it, television is less than 100 years old, even though it's become so ubiquitous in our society. 1939, RCA was the first public television demonstration at the New York's World's Fair. 1940s is when cable wires were used for signal transmission in cities, places like Oregon, New York, and Pennsylvania, because the large buildings were blocking the signals, and also mountains were blocking the signals. Very ironic when you think about the importance of cable in the 80s and the 90s. 1950s to 1960s is when communication satellites were put into space for signal amplification. The 1950s, HBO was the first cable network to use satellites, and this led to narrowcasting, the specialized programming for specific demographic groups, something that that's become commonplace with the internet. 1980s pay-per-view, where you could actually pay for accessing for particular programming in addition to whatever payment you might be offering for subscription or any payment that might be obtained through advertising. The 2000s is where we began video on demand. This began time shifting, that you didn't necessarily have to wait for a television program to air. You could decide when to watch, putting the power with the consumer. 2009 was the shift from radio analog signals, and that meant limited frequencies, to digital. And we know that with digital, with its binary 0 and 1 transmission signals, has led to a almost limitless possibility for transmissions. And then in 2010, as we've seen with other media, convergence. This is where we had computer and mobile devices. This is where we had streaming. So a couple of points to think about from a decade perspective. 1950s is when color TV was introduced. This was the shift, as I indicated, from the single sponsor programming to multiple sponsors in prime time. Prime time was considered from 8 to 11 p.m. Those would be the times after work but before sleep. The 1950s were also known for the quiz show scandal. Quiz shows were very popular during the 1950s, and they were rigged. And the public was shocked that television would show something that wasn't real. Again, we're very jaded. We expect that. And our reality shows in the 2020s are hardly reality shows. I hope I'm not bursting anybody's bubble by saying that. Old radio programs were repurposed. I Love Lucy, for instance, perhaps one of the most famous television shows because they had the foresight to film on film stock, so they were able to preserve those images very well, and as opposed to other programs that deteriorated over time. Those radio programs started on the radio and then moved to television. This was with the introduction of the situation comedy. I Love Lucy really led to the idea of what was known as the sitcom, with its heyday probably being in the 1990s. So it's also a time of anthology dramas. Twilight Zone is perhaps one of the most famous. One of my favorite Twilight anthology shows, or one of my favorite anthology shows, period. The Twilight Zone had some of the best short story writers of the day, so it really was an example of television at its finest. 1960s is when public television was introduced. The idea that television could serve the public interest. This is where there was a lot of program that was geared towards education and children. When you think about things like Sesame Street or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, for instance, both became cultural icons. The first presidential television debate aired in the 1960s between Nixon and Kennedy. And in some of the videos that I've asked you to watch, you will see that reference. It was so important because it really changed the idea of how television debates were done. Previously, they were done mostly on the radio. The Nixon-Kennedy debate was the first debate where approximately half of the audience listened to the debate on the radio and approximately half watched it on TV. And the pundits found two very different reactions with these two different audiences. The individuals who watched the debate on television, the majority felt that Kennedy won the debate because he appeared presidential. The majority of individuals who listened to the debate felt that Nixon won the debate because he sounded presidential. And it really was the moment where I think politicians realized the importance of image, not just content, in their political campaigns. For better or for worse, that's where we are today. Walter Cronkite, a very respected news personality. We talked about this, that there was a time when news personalities were trusted and were given a certain amount of gravitas, probably the best known being Walter Cronkite. His investigation into the Vietnam War and his opposition to the Vietnam War had great political sway over the American public, which meant that had great political sway over the political establishment of the time. I doubt there's any kind of newscaster in our contemporary time that has that kind of political power. 1969 is when the first man on the moon was broadcast to over 650 million plus global viewers. Perhaps the event that helped unify us as humanity more than any other event on television. And the 1970s is when cable local access channels came into play. So now you could have local access programming to benefit the communities that were watching from those particular local access stations. It was also the time of the TV miniseries where you could have something that almost mimicked the film. In fact, it would go beyond the film because there would be multiple episodes, probably the most famous being Roots, that helped to educate an entire generation about slavery. The 1980s was the heyday of soap operas, both day and evening. Evening soap opera Dallas. The question was who shot the central character, who shot JR. An entire summer, which is when TV programming went into hiatus, was spent with people asking that question. I was a kid at the time, and I remember this very clearly. I also remember daytime soap operas such as General Hospital. And in fact, one episode of General Hospital, and it's still on today, General Hospital, that soap opera. One episode, a marriage between two central characters, Luke and Laura, had the highest viewership of any daytime programming at the time and ever since. And I can tell you that this was such a phenomenon, this relationship between Luke and Laura and their marriage. College classes were being scheduled around the time of the programming of the show, which was, depending on whether you lived on the East Coast or the West Coast, either 2 p.m. in the afternoon or 3 p.m. in the afternoon, because they couldn't get students because everybody was watching General Hospital and what was happening with Luke and Laura. Again, I was a kid at the time, and I very much remember the kind of hysteria in pop culture around Luke and Laura. And I, too, witnessed on that television their marriage. So cable news also began in the 1980s, CNN, and the hope was that 24-hour news programming would lead to an education of the citizenry, the opportunity to examine news in depth in the way that you couldn't necessarily do. Sadly, as we saw with Outfox, we see what the reality is. It was just recycling short news segments and replaying them over and over again, and becoming increasingly partisan and increasingly engaging emotion rather than talking about news in any kind of journalistic sense, or at least what we used to think of in terms of journalism. 1983, and again, this would be the heyday of television. There was a sitcom by the name of MASH, and you might have heard of it. And even though it was a situation comedy, it also dealt with dramatic themes. So there was a blending of genres, and it was a very highly acclaimed show. It happened to be about doctors in the Korean War in a MASH unit in a mobile army surgical hospital. And their concluding episode, the season finale, drew over 1 million viewers, myself included. And again, I'm very much from that television generation. That would have been when I was a teenager. Again, I doubt there will be any kind of television programming that could draw that kind of communal experience or those kinds of numbers. 1990s is where we had video recording that really led to time shifting, so that ultimately we didn't necessarily have to, as audience members, rely on the time of television programming. We could watch at our convenience. So that completely changed the landscape of television. The 2000s, reality television, and this came out of a television writer's strike where they were trying to strike for more money, the television writers, because oftentimes it was the actors who were getting all of the profits. And what television did was, rather than settle, they put in cheap reality television programming in its place, and found out that it was quite popular and much less expensive in order to produce and to air, because you didn't need all of these highly paid actors. And once the television writer strike was resolved, TV never really went back to its old days of programming. We've seen how reality television took a hold then and still has a hold now. And of course, reality television is a misnomer because it's very much staged. But as we saw with Outfoxed, much of that is staged as well. 2010s, of course, media convergence. This is where you can view TV on other media, such as smartphones. And this is where television is produced by other corporations not specializing in television, such as Netflix, for instance, which was specializing in film. They went into the role of television programming in addition to television broadcasting. They started with broadcasting television series, and then they began producing their own. And then when you get to the 2020s, you think about series that have been produced by Netflix, for instance, Squid Games and Stranger Things, and the kinds of cultural phenomenons they've become. And the binging that has occurred from the 2020s, I think in part because of the pandemic, where individuals could see multiple television shows over a long period of time. And thinking about this formula for Stranger Things, it really was brilliant in many respects. Rather than releasing it episode by episode, releasing it season by season so that you could binge, which is what many people did this past Memorial Day when the newest season of Stranger Things came out. And even more interestingly, they released all of the seasons, or they released all of the episodes of the last season, except for the last 2 episodes, which was brilliant marketing, so that they could release that in July. So they were able to use the word of mouth from Memorial Day in June to basically rocket Stranger Things into a phenomenon by July. So, and I myself was included in part of that phenomenon. It's one of my favorite television shows. Though I can say that as much maligned as television is, you can have some wonderful television. And I think about a TV show like Breaking Bad, which I've always argued is just a literary adaptation, of a contemporary literary adaptation, I should say, contemporary adaptation of Oedipus the King, about the fall of a man because of outside forces, and also because of flaws in character. We could debate whether that man is a great man or not, but if you haven't seen Breaking Bad, I so highly encourage you to watch Breaking Bad. Now, that said, you can see that in the 5th element of our notes below, I have several videos for you to watch. One is entitled Television History. It was done by Films for the Humanities and the Sciences. It's a bit dated, 1997, but it gives you a history of television that's 28 minutes long. I do note that you need to access that through the GCC library, Films on Demand, which means that you need to go through the GCC library system. So either you need to go to the library, or you need to have a library card so that you can access it electronically. So if you don't yet have access to the GCC library system electronically from home, this is your time to do it, because you've got wonderful resources available through the GCC library. I also wanted you to watch a 9-minute on that, and that video is approximately 28 minutes long. Can't remember if I mentioned that or not. There is another video that's approximately 9 minutes long. This is on the general internet. The Cultural Impact of TV by GPB Education, which gives a nice overview. And then Most Memorable Moments in TV History and Top TV Moments in History. One is from CBS News, one is from Global News, one is 2 minutes long, one is 3 minutes long. They're both reporting on a 2020 survey that was done from, that was data that was compiled from TV viewers about their opinion about what the most memorable moments in TV history were and why. And of course, that's subjective. And then lastly, that TED Talk that I was referencing about how TV reflects our culture and our culture reflects TV. The Conscience of TV, that came out in 2012. That's 13 minutes long, and that also is on the open internet. So the only video that is not on the open internet is the first video about television history that you need to access through the GCC website. And the attendance question, which I'm going to ask you to respond to on our attendance form, on our discussion forum by Thursday, the 18th at 1 p.m. What do you think is the most culturally significant television moment, and why? What do you think is our most culturally significant television moment, and why? And obviously there are no right or wrong answers. I'm looking for your thinking rather than not necessarily just your answer. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. I will leave you to watch those videos, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.